The radio crackled with static, then silence. 47 seconds of absolute nothing before Staff Sergeant Marcus Bull Rodriguez's voice cut through the mountain air like shattered glass. "Command, this is Viper 7. We are compromised. Repeat, we are compromised." His breathing was ragged, each word punctuated by distant rifle fire echoing off the Afghan peaks. "Air support is negative. Repeat, air support is negative. We are on our own." 3,000 feet above, Major Catalina Raven Kozlova banked her F-16C Fighting Falcon into a steep turn, the G-forces pressing her deeper into her ejection seat. The heads-up display painted the mountainous terrain in ghostly green lines, but her eyes were fixed on the tactical frequency crackling in her headset. She wasn't supposed to be here. Her mission had been a routine patrol along the Pakistani border, a milk run, the squadron called it. Babysitting duty for the new girl who'd only been in country for 6 weeks. But 18 minutes ago, everything changed. The Taliban ambush had torn through Viper 7's reconnaissance patrol like a buzzsaw through paper. 8 Navy SEALs pinned down in a valley so remote it didn't have a name on any map, only grid coordinates that might as well have been coordinates to hell itself. The closest Apache gunships were 40 minutes out, refueling at Bagram. The A-10 Warthogs were grounded for maintenance. And the brass had just given the order every ground soldier dreads hearing: no assets available. Execute tactical withdrawal. Tactical withdrawal. Military speak for your fucked good luck. Rodriguez's voice came again, strained now, desperate. "Command, we've got at least 30 tangos on the high ground. They've got us zeroed. We can't move without getting cut to pieces." A pause. Static. Then barely a whisper. "We're not going home, are we?" Kozlova's gloved hand hovered over the radio transmit button. She could see them now, tiny heat signatures scattered behind inadequate cover in a bowl-shaped valley that had become their tomb. The Taliban fighters were positioned perfectly, classic L-shaped ambush with interlocking fields of fire. It was textbook. It was brilliant. It was murder. Her fuel gauge showed 23 minutes of flight time remaining. Not enough to make a difference, according to every tactical manual she'd ever read. Not enough to change the outcome, according to every risk assessment protocol drilled into her head at the Air Force Academy. Not enough, according to everyone who'd ever looked at her and seen just another pretty face trying to prove she belonged in a cockpit. But Catalina Kozlova had never been good at accepting what everyone else thought was impossible. Her father had learned that the hard way in a Siberian gulag. Her instructors had learned it the hard way at Colorado Springs. And today, 30 Taliban fighters were about to learn it the hardest way of all. She pressed the transmit button. Dawn was still 90 minutes away when Catalina's F-16 first appeared on Rodriguez's thermal scope as nothing more than a contrail scratching across the pre-dawn darkness. The SEAL team leader had been in the mountains for 72 hours, long enough to know the difference between hope and hallucination. This felt like hallucination. No pilot would be crazy enough to provide close air support in these conditions. Not in a single-seat fighter. Not with mountains on all sides reaching up like stone fingers trying to snatch aircraft from the sky. "Unknown aircraft, this is Viper 7 actual," Rodriguez whispered into his radio, pressing himself deeper into the shallow depression that was keeping him alive. "Please identify yourself." The voice that came back was calm, professional, and undeniably female. "Viper 7, this is Raven 1-1. I see your position. You've got company coming down from the northeast ridge." Rodriguez squinted through his night vision scope. She was right. Another dozen Taliban fighters were picking their way down the rocky slope, moving to flank his team's already precarious position. In 10 minutes, maybe 15, it would all be over. "Raven 1-1, be advised we have no air support authorization. Command has declared this area too hot for close air support." A pause, then with just the slightest hint of what might have been amusement. "Viper 7, I didn't copy that last transmission. You're breaking up." Rodriguez almost smiled despite everything. He'd heard stories about pilots like this, cowboys who bent rules like pipe cleaners and somehow never got caught. He'd never believed they actually existed. Raven 1-1, what's your loadout? 2 AIM 120 AMRAAMs, 2 AIM 9 Sidewinders, and a full magazine of 20mm, plus one extremely bad attitude. This time, Rodriguez did smile. His team was spread across 50 meters of broken ground, each man in his own private hell, but all of them listening to this conversation. Corporal Danny Prophet, Washington, caught Rodriguez's eye from behind a boulder and gave him a thumbs up. Even in the green wash of night vision, Rodriguez could see the kid was grinning. Above them, Catalina was already running calculations. The valley was narrow, maybe 400 meters across at its widest point. The Taliban positions were dug in along the eastern ridge, roughly 200 feet above the SEALs. Perfect geography for an ambush, terrible geography for close air support. One mistake and she'd paint the mountainside with her own aircraft. Another mistake and she'd paint it with friendly casualties. She'd trained for this scenario exactly once, during a classified exercise in Nevada that had gone so badly they'd scrubbed it from the official records. 17 pilots had attempted it. 17 had failed. The instructors had declared the exercise unsurvivable under real-world conditions. That was before Catalina Kozlova proved them wrong about everything else. The first strafing run came out of nowhere. A thunderclap of 20mm cannon fire that split the mountain silence like an axe through kindling. Catalina brought her F-16 down the valley at 300 feet, so low the Taliban fighters could see her navigation lights strobing red and white against the gray dawn sky. The GAU-20 Vulcan cannon vomited shells at 3,700 rounds per minute, each depleted uranium round designed to punch through armored vehicles. Against human targets behind rocks, the effect was biblical. The northeastern ridge erupted in geysers of stone and smoke. Bodies tumbled down the slope like broken dolls. The flanking movement that would have ended Viper 7's resistance in minutes simply ceased to exist. Holy shit, Prophet's voice cut across the tactical frequency. Did you see that? Did you fucking see that? Rodriguez keyed his radio. Raven 1-1, that was beautiful. What's your fuel state? 18 minutes. I'm staying until the cavalry arrives or I flame out, whichever comes first. The Taliban had scattered after the first gun run, but they weren't broken. Rodriguez could see muzzle flashes from new positions. They were adapting, spreading out, making themselves harder targets. These weren't farm boys with AK-47s. These were experienced fighters who'd learned to survive American air power through 4 years of continuous warfare. Raven 1-1, they're repositioning. We've got movement on the southern slope now. I see them. Catalina's voice was different now, focused in a way that made Rodriguez think of a surgeon describing a particularly complex operation. Viper 7, I need you to mark your positions with infrared strobes. I'm going to get creative. Creative. Rodriguez had been in enough shitstorms to know that when pilots started getting creative, things either got very good or very bad very quickly. He activated his IR strobe and watched as 6 more strobes began blinking in the darkness, marking his team's positions for the pilot who was risking everything to keep them alive. What happened next would be studied in tactical flight schools for the next decade, though none of the analysis could capture what it felt like to watch Catalina Kozlova turn an F-16 Fighting Falcon into a guardian angel with wings. She came in from the south this time, flying up the valley instead of down it, using the mountain walls to mask her approach until the last possible second. The Taliban fighters on the southern slope saw her just as she pulled into a near-vertical climb, afterburners painting twin orange streaks across the sky. At the apex of her climb, she rolled inverted and dove, bringing the nose of her aircraft to bear on the scattered insurgent positions with surgical precision. The second gun run was shorter than the first but twice as effective. Catalina had spent 3 years flying close air support in Iraq, learning to thread the needle between friendly and enemy forces with margins measured in meters instead of kilometers. She'd learned from pilots who'd learned from pilots who'd been doing this since Vietnam, carrying forward an unbroken chain of hard-won knowledge about how to make an airplane into a precision weapon. The GAU-20 spoke again, shorter bursts this time, each one targeted with the kind of accuracy that came from understanding exactly how gravity affected 20-millimeter rounds at different airspeeds and altitudes. Taliban positions that had seemed untouchable minutes before were reduced to craters and silence. Splash 6, Catalina reported, her voice still calm despite pulling 5GS in a climbing turn that would have left most people unconscious. How copy, Viper 7? Rodriguez was looking through his thermal scope, watching heat signatures disappear from the ridgelines like candles being blown out. The valley that had been alive with muzzle flashes was suddenly, eerily quiet. Good copy, Raven 1-1. The neighborhood just got a lot quieter. What's your fuel state? 12 minutes. Still enough time to ruin someone's day if they're feeling ambitious. The radio crackled as Prophet's excited voice cut through. Raven 1-1, this is Viper 7-3. That was the most beautiful thing I've ever seen, and I once watched Jessica Alba eat a cheeseburger. Despite everything, despite the death and violence and fear that had defined the last hour, Rodriguez found himself laughing. They all were. 8 Navy SEALs who'd been writing their last letters in their heads were suddenly cracking jokes and swapping stories like they were sitting around a campfire, instead of huddled behind rocks in hostile territory. But Catalina knew better than to celebrate too early. She'd seen enough battles turn in the space of a heartbeat to know that silence didn't necessarily mean victory. She kept her F-16 in a wide orbit around the valley, eyes constantly scanning for new threats, fingers ready to bring hell down on anyone stupid enough to take another shot at her boys. Her boys, when had she started thinking of them that way? The Taliban weren't finished. They were regrouping, calling for reinforcements, adapting their tactics to deal with the American pilot who just turned their perfect ambush into a nightmare. Rodriguez could hear them on the radio, Dari and Pashto voices coordinating a new assault, bringing in fresh fighters who'd learned from watching their comrades die. Raven 1-1, we've got movement on all sides now, Rodriguez reported, his voice tight with controlled tension. Looks like they called in the whole neighborhood. Catalina banked her F-16 into a tighter orbit, her radar warning receiver suddenly alive with new contacts. Something was coming, something big. Her threat display lit up like a Christmas tree as surface-to-air missile systems came online. The Taliban had learned that to kill the Angel, you had to bring bigger guns. Viper 7, I'm picking up SAM activity. They've got Stingers down there, maybe worse. This is about to get interesting. Rodriguez felt his stomach drop. Stinger missiles were bad enough, but if the Taliban had managed to get their hands on something more sophisticated, a Russian SA-24 or one of the Chinese systems that had been flooding the black market, then their guardian angel was about to become a target herself. Raven 1-1, you need to get out of here. We can hold until the Apache arrive. Negative, Viper 7. Nobody gets left behind, not on my watch. The first missile came from the eastern ridge, a streak of white fire that missed Catalina's F-16 by less than 50 feet. She pulled into a vertical climb, dispensing chaff and flares in a glittering cloud that turned the dawn sky into a deadly light show. The missile seeker head lost lock, and the weapon exploded harmlessly in the chaff cloud, but Rodriguez knew they'd gotten lucky. They're learning, Catalina muttered, more to herself than to the radio. She'd faced Stingers before, in Iraq and Afghanistan both, but never while trying to provide close air support in terrain like this. The mountains limited her maneuvering options while providing perfect firing positions for the missile teams below. The second missile came from the west, then a third from the south. Someone down there knew exactly what they were doing, coordinating the launches to force her into an impossible choice. Catalina threw her F-16 into a series of violent maneuvers that would have torn a lesser aircraft apart, pulling GS that pushed her vision gray at the edges while dispensing countermeasures in carefully timed sequences. But physics was physics, and fuel was fuel. Each evasive maneuver burned precious JP-8, bringing her closer to the moment when she'd have no choice but to leave Viper 7 to their fate. "Fuel states 7 minutes," she reported, her voice betraying none of the calculations running through her head. 7 minutes to make a difference. 7 minutes to save 8 lives. 7 minutes to prove that sometimes impossible was just another word for difficult. The Taliban had made a mistake, though. In their eagerness to bring down the American pilot, they'd revealed their positions. Catalina could see the missile teams now, 3 Stinger positions forming a triangle around the valley, plus at least 24 rifle-armed fighters moving to reinforce the ambush. "Viper 7, I'm going to make one more gun run. When I do, I need you to move. All of you together toward the LZ coordinates I'm about to give you. Don't stop, don't look back, don't wait for anyone who falls behind." "Copy." Rodriguez understood immediately. She was going to sacrifice her remaining fuel to give them one chance, one desperate sprint toward an extraction point that might or might not be clear. It was a long shot wrapped in a Hail Mary and tied with a prayer, but it was better than dying in place. "Copy, Raven 1-1, we'll be ready." Catalina Kozlova had grown up in Brighton Beach, the daughter of a Soviet naval officer who defected during the Cold War and spent the next 20 years proving his loyalty to his adopted country. She'd learned English by watching Top Gun on repeat until she could recite every line, dreaming of the day she'd trade her father's stories of MiG-29s for the real thing. The Air Force Academy had been her ticket out of Brooklyn, but it had taken her 4 years to prove she belonged there, and another 4 to prove she deserved to fly fighters instead of transport planes. Everyone had an opinion about women in combat roles. The instructors who thought she was too small to handle a fighter's G-forces. The fellow pilots who thought she was too emotional to make life-and-death decisions. The ground crews who thought she was too pretty to take seriously. She'd heard all the jokes, weathered all the condescension, absorbed all the casual sexism that came with being the only woman in rooms full of men who'd never had to prove they belonged. But none of that mattered now. The only thing that mattered was 8 Navy SEALs who were counting on her to get them home alive. She brought her F-16 around for one final gun run, flying lower than she'd ever flown in combat, so low that her wingtips were almost brushing the valley walls. The Taliban fighters could see her coming this time. They had 30 seconds to make their peace with whatever god they prayed to. The GAU-20 cannon erupted in a sustained burst that seemed to last forever, spent casings tumbling through the air like deadly confetti. Catalina walked her fire across the eastern ridge, then the western, then back to the south, systematically destroying everything that moved and quite a few things that didn't. When the gun fell silent, she pulled into a climb so steep that only the F-16's thrust-to-weight ratio kept her from falling out of the sky. Below, 8 figures in desert camouflage broke from cover and began running towards salvation, their boots pounding against rocks that were still smoking from 20mm impacts. They ran like men who understood that this was their only chance, covering ground with the desperate efficiency that came from knowing that hesitation meant death. Rodriguez was first to the extraction point, a relatively flat area of ground that might, just might, be large enough for a helicopter to land. He threw himself behind a boulder and immediately began scanning for threats, his rifle ready to cover his teammates as they arrived one by one. Prophet came next, then Kowalski, then Martinez. Each man arrived breathing hard but still in fighting condition, still ready to hold their ground until help arrived. This was what they'd trained for, not the ambush itself, but the desperate scramble for survival that came after. "Raven 1-1, Viper 7 is at the LZ, Rodriguez reported. "All 8 souls accounted for." "Copy that. Apache flight is inbound, ETA 6 minutes. I'm going to orbit until they arrive. Rodriguez checked his watch. She had to be running on fumes by now, but she was still up there, still watching over them like some kind of mechanical guardian angel. He'd never seen anything like it. The precision, the courage, the absolute refusal to abandon her mission even when every regulation and protocol said she should. In the distance, he could see Taliban fighters regrouping, preparing for one last assault before the helicopters arrived. They knew their window was closing, but they weren't giving up. Rodriguez had to admire their persistence, even as he prepared to kill as many of them as possible. Raven 1-1, we've got movement from the north. Looks like they're bringing the whole village. Above the valley, Catalina's fuel gauge was showing 2 minutes of flight time remaining. Not enough to make another gun run. Not enough to provide effective cover. Just enough to watch 8 good men die unless the Apache arrived in the next 60 seconds. She'd done everything she could with the weapons she had. Now it was time to improvise. The idea was insane. It violated every safety protocol in the Air Force manual, and probably a few laws of physics as well. But Catalina had never been one to let impossibility stand in the way of necessity, and right now, 8 Navy SEALs needed a miracle more than she needed to follow regulations. She rolled her F-16 inverted and dove toward the valley floor, pushing her airspeed past the aircraft's published limits. The Taliban fighters advancing on the LZ looked up to see 30,000 pounds of American aerospace engineering screaming toward them at 400 miles per hour, afterburners painting twin orange trails across the dawn sky. At the last possible second, Catalina pulled out of the dive and lit her afterburners, the twin Pratt and Whitney engines producing enough thrust to power a small city. The sonic boom that followed shattered windows in villages 20 miles away and sent the attacking Taliban fighters diving for cover, their advance broken by the primal terror of having a fighter aircraft pass overhead close enough to touch. "Holy Mother of God," Prophet whispered, watching the F-16 climb away from the valley floor. Did she just buzz the entire Taliban army? Rodriguez was grinning despite everything. I think she just bought us another 5 minutes. The radio crackled. Viper 7, this is Apache 6-7. We have you visual. ETA 90 seconds. Get ready for extraction. Catalina's fuel gauge was now showing 30 seconds of flight time. She could see the 2 Apache gunships approaching from the east, their rotors chopping through the morning air like mechanical thunderclaps. In 90 seconds, her boys would be safe. All she had to do was keep her aircraft in the air for 90 more seconds. The engine flamed out at 28 seconds. The sudden silence was deafening. One moment she was flying the most advanced fighter aircraft in the world. The next, she was piloting a very expensive glider with the aerodynamic properties of a falling refrigerator. The F-16 began to drop, its nose pitching forward as gravity took control. "Mayday, mayday, mayday," Catalina transmitted, her voice calm despite the fact that she was falling out of the sky. "This is Raven 1-1. I have engine failure and I'm going down." Rodriguez watched in horror as the F-16 disappeared behind a ridge line to the west. The woman who just saved their lives was now the one who needed saving, and there wasn't a damn thing he could do about it except watch and pray. The Apache arrived 30 seconds later, their door gunners already engaging Taliban positions as the aircraft settled into hover positions around the LZ. Rodriguez and his team were bundled aboard with the practiced efficiency of crews who'd done this hundreds of times before, but his eyes remained fixed on the western ridge where smoke was beginning to rise. "Apache 6-7, we need to check on Raven 1-1's crash site," Rodriguez said into his headset. "Negative, Viper 7. Too hot and we're already overweight. Search and rescue will handle it." Rodriguez wanted to argue, wanted to demand they go after the pilot who'd risked everything to save them, but he knew the Apache pilot was right. They were already pushing the envelope by extracting 8 fully equipped SEALs in a hot LZ. Adding a combat search and rescue mission would endanger everyone. As the helicopter banked away from the valley, Rodriguez caught one last glimpse of the crash site. There was no fire, which meant Catalina might have survived the impact. There was also no movement, which meant she might not have. All they could do now was wait, and hope that search and rescue reached her before the Taliban did. The crash had been textbook, if there was such a thing as a textbook way to auger in an F-16 Fighting Falcon at 200 miles per hour. Catalina had managed to find the one patch of relatively flat ground within 10 miles, a narrow strip of rocky terrain between two mountain peaks that was just barely wide enough to accommodate her aircraft's wingspan. The ejection seat had worked perfectly, rocketing her clear of the aircraft 3 seconds before impact. The parachute had deployed at exactly the right altitude, bringing her down in a controlled descent that deposited her roughly 50 meters from the wreckage of her fighter. By any reasonable measure, she should have been dead 3 times over. Instead, she was sitting behind a boulder with a sprained ankle, a mild concussion, and a growing appreciation for the engineers who designed her survival gear. The seat pack had contained everything she needed to stay alive for 72 hours: water, rations, medical supplies, a radio, and a M9 pistol with 3 magazines. What it didn't contain was enough ammunition to fight off the Taliban search party that was undoubtedly heading her way. She keyed her survival radio, broadcasting on the emergency frequency. Any station, this is Raven 11. I am down and alive at grid coordinates." She rattled off her position, knowing that American forces would be monitoring the frequency, but also knowing that the Taliban might be listening too. The response came immediately. "Raven 11, this is Bagram Search and Rescue. We copy your position and we're launching now. ETA 45 minutes. Can you hold until then?" Catalina looked at her pistol, then at the mountain peaks surrounding her position. 45 minutes was a lifetime when people were actively trying to kill you, but she'd been in worse situations. At least, she thought she had. The specifics were a little fuzzy thanks to the concussion. "Copy Bagram Sar, I'll be here." What she didn't tell them was that she could already hear voices echoing off the mountain walls, Dari and Pashto conversations growing closer by the minute. The Taliban fighters who'd survived her gun runs were coming to collect their prize, and they were bringing friends. Catalina Kozlova had never planned on being captured. In 4 years of combat flying, she'd never even considered the possibility. Pilots died in aircraft accidents or got shot down and killed on impact. They didn't survive crashes only to spend their remaining hours hiding behind rocks while insurgents closed in on their position. But here she was, concussed and alone on a mountainside in Afghanistan, with nothing but a pistol and the kind of stubborn determination that had carried her from Brooklyn to the cockpit of an F-16. Her father had survived 3 years in a Soviet gulag by refusing to give up. Her grandmother had survived the siege of Leningrad by eating wallpaper paste and never losing hope. Survival was in her DNA, along with a pathological inability to quit when things got difficult. The voices were getting closer now. She could make out individual words, fragments of conversation that her language training allowed her to understand. They were organizing search teams, dividing up the mountainside into sectors, coordinating their approach like professionals who'd done this before. She checked her watch. 38 minutes until search and rescue arrived. 38 minutes to stay alive and avoid capture by fighters who would consider a female American pilot the prize of a lifetime. The first Taliban fighter came around the boulder at a fast walk, his AK-47 at the ready, but his attention focused on the crashed F-16 rather than on immediate threats. Catalina put 2 rounds center mass from a distance of 15 feet, the M9's reports echoing off the mountain walls like thunder. The fighter dropped without a sound, but his death would bring the others running. She had perhaps 30 seconds before they converged on her position, 30 seconds to find better cover or make peace with her situation. She moved, ignoring the pain in her ankle as she scrambled up the rocky slope toward a cluster of boulders that might provide better defensive positions. Behind her, she could hear shouts and running footsteps as the search party responded to the gunshots. 29 minutes until rescue. The second fighter appeared as she reached the boulder cluster, his rifle already trained on her position. She dove behind cover as automatic fire chewed chunks out of the rock where her head had been moments before. The ricochet whine of bullets filled the air, punctuated by the steady thump-thump-thump of AK-47 rounds impacting stone. She returned fire, 3 quick shots that forced the fighter to duck behind his own cover. The range was maybe 40 meters, close enough to be accurate with the M9, far enough to give her a chance to move if she needed to. But movement was becoming increasingly problematic. More fighters were arriving every minute, and they were coordinating their approach with the kind of tactical sophistication that suggested professional military training. These weren't farm boys with rifles. These were soldiers who understood fields of fire and envelopment tactics. 26 minutes. The radio in her survival pack crackled. Raven 1-1, this is Bagram SAR. We're tracking multiple heat signatures at your location. How copy? Multiple hostiles engaged, she replied, punctuating her transmission with 2 more pistol shots. I'm in defensive positions about 50 meters northeast of the crash site. How far out are you? 22 minutes. Can you hold that long? Catalina looked at her remaining ammunition. 1 magazine in the pistol, 2 in reserve. Roughly 30 rounds to hold off what appeared to be at least a dozen Taliban fighters who were systematically surrounding her position. I'll be here, she said. She'd always wondered what her father had thought about during those 3 years in the Gulag, whether he'd counted days or tried not to think about time at all, whether he'd made plans for the future or focused entirely on surviving the present moment. She'd never asked him, and now she never would. He died of a heart attack 2 years ago, taking his stories with him. But she was beginning to understand that survival wasn't about having enough ammunition or finding perfect cover. It was about refusing to accept defeat even when defeat was the only logical outcome. It was about making the other guy pay such a high price for victory that he might decide the game wasn't worth playing. The Taliban fighters were getting bolder now, moving from cover to cover in coordinated rushes that brought them steadily closer to her position. She made them pay for every meter, forcing them to duck and dodge and think twice about taking unnecessary risks. But mathematics was mathematics, and she was badly outnumbered. 18 minutes. That's when she heard the helicopter. It wasn't the rescue bird, too early for that, and the sound was wrong anyway. This was a smaller aircraft, moving fast and low, the distinctive whop-whop-whop of rotor blades echoing off the mountain walls. Raven 1-1, this is Dustoff 7-9. Heard you might need a ride. Catalina almost laughed. A medical evacuation helicopter, probably diverted from another mission, had decided to attempt a combat pickup in broad daylight on a mountainside crawling with Taliban fighters. The crew had to be either completely insane or incredibly brave. Probably both. Dustoff 7-9, this LZ is extremely hot. I count at least 12 hostiles in the immediate area. Copy that, we see them. Stand by for gun runs. The U-60 Black Hawk appeared over the ridge line like an avenging angel, its door gunners already engaging Taliban positions with M240 machine guns. The aircraft banked hard around Catalina's position, laying down suppressive fire that sent insurgent fighters diving for whatever cover they could find. Raven 1-1, when we come around again, I need you to run toward our 3 o'clock position. We'll hover as low as we can, but you're going to have to jump for it. Jump for it. At any other time, the suggestion would have been laughable. But with Taliban fighters closing in from 3 directions and her ammunition running low, jumping for a moving helicopter seemed like the most reasonable thing in the world. The Black Hawk came around again, its rotors churning up a dust cloud that provided perfect concealment for Catalina's sprint towards salvation. She ran like her life depended on it, because it did, ignoring the pain in her ankle and the bullets that whined past her head like angry hornets. The helicopter was hovering 3 feet off the ground, crew members hanging out the doors with their hands extended. Catalina took a running leap and felt strong arms grab her flight suit, hauling her aboard as the aircraft pulled into a climbing turn that left her stomach somewhere back on the mountainside. "Welcome aboard, ma'am," the crew chief said, grinning at her over the sound of the engines. "Hell of a thing you did down there." Catalina looked back at the valley where 8 Navy SEALs had been pinned down 6 hours earlier. The sun was fully up now, painting the mountains in shades of gold and amber that made the terrain look almost peaceful. You'd never know that men had died there, that a battle had been fought and won by the narrowest of margins. "Just doing my job," she said. But even as she said it, she knew it wasn't true. She'd gone far beyond doing her job. She'd done something that would be remembered, something that would matter. 8 men were going home to their families because she'd refused to follow orders that didn't make sense. One female pilot had proven that sometimes the impossible was just another word for difficult. The news broke 6 hours later, though the official version bore only a passing resemblance to what had actually happened on that mountainside. The Pentagon's press release mentioned a successful tactical extraction and exemplary close air support, but it didn't mention that the pilot providing that support had been explicitly ordered not to engage. It didn't mention that she'd continued fighting even after her fuel ran low. And it definitely didn't mention that she'd crashed her aircraft, rather than abandon the men she'd been protecting. Major Catalina Kozlova was officially commended for professional excellence in the performance of her duties. Unofficially, she was quietly transferred to a training squadron in Nevada, where she could continue flying without the inconvenient possibility of making the kind of decisions that gave Pentagon lawyers sleepless nights. But word travels fast in the military community, especially word about pilots who turn impossible situations into improbable victories. Within a week, everyone in the Air Force had heard some version of the story. Within a month, it had spread to other services. By the end of the year, pulling a Raven had entered the unofficial lexicon as military slang for refusing to abandon your mission regardless of orders or circumstances. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez put in for a transfer to Special Operations Command, where he could work with pilots who understood that the mission came first and paperwork came second. Prophet stayed with the SEALs but never stopped talking about the female F-16 pilot who'd saved their lives with nothing but skill, courage, and an absolute refusal to accept defeat. The other 6 members of Viper 7 went their separate ways, but they all carried the same story, the same appreciation for what one pilot had done when it mattered most. Catalina herself adapted to her new role with characteristic determination. Training new pilots wasn't as exciting as combat missions, but it was important work. Every student who passed through her classroom learned not just how to fly close air support, but how to make the kind of decisions that meant the difference between bringing everyone home and leaving body bags on foreign mountainsides. She never talked about what happened in Afghanistan, at least not officially. But sometimes, late at night in the officers' club, she'd find herself surrounded by younger pilots who wanted to hear the story from someone who'd been there. They'd ply her with drinks and ask careful questions, trying to understand how someone makes the choice to risk everything for people they'd never met. Her answer was always the same: you don't choose. You just do what needs to be done and you hope it's enough. But privately, she knew it was more complicated than that. It was about proving something, to herself, to the men who'd questioned whether women belonged in fighter cockpits, to everyone who'd ever looked at her and seen limitations instead of possibilities. It was about her father's stories of standing up to totalitarian bullies, about her grandmother's refusal to surrender even when surrender was the logical choice. Most of all, it was about understanding that some things were worth risking everything for. 8 Navy SEALs had learned that lesson in a valley that didn't have a name. Catalina Kozlova had learned it in the